But every now and then, as we're going through these processes, we meet somebody and you just go, that's not somebody I want to compete with. It's almost like a question if you ask yourself, do I want to compete with that person? If you don't want to compete with somebody, that's a powerful indicator.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Demo Day, the podcast for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, where we demystify the culture of joining one of the top VCs, accelerators, or incubator programs from around the world. On today's episode, we'll be interviewing Ben Savage from Clocktower Venture Partners. Without further ado, let's get into Demo Day. Ben, welcome to another episode of Demo Day.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Now, Ben, the last time we had you on the show, it was 2022. So it's been a couple years now since you and I have had a chance to jam. And you know, I know you grew up in Boston. You've had an incredible early career. And now that you're here at, Clocktower Ventures the past 13 years.
Wow, 13 years.
13
That's that
years.
long. Okay.
13 years. On our last show, we had a lot of opportunity to hear kind of your upbringing. And I think today I'm really excited to learn more about just the way you think about investing, founders, startups. So, I want to start the podcast very similar to how we did last time, and that's really around the why. At this point now, you're 10 plus years into this, this role here of running the team, and I'm just curious, why is startups and tech and venture and investing so important to you?
First and foremost, and this I think aligns with some of your question, like how we actually invest. Venture capital at the end of the day is a people business. We get to partner and support, really serve some of the most interesting human beings on the planet. And that's incredibly fulfilling when you get to do that, right? You get to spend time learning from these unbelievable, creative, high energy people who are trying to do something that they know is really hard to do, where the odds are against them, like most startups don't work. But that if they do succeed, they're able to really make a difference and a dent in the world and transform our society for the better. And so it's actually, I think, a great privilege to be able to do that all day long and constantly be energized by new ideas, new people that we get to meet, but also to build really deep, satisfying relationships with the founders in our portfolio and the people actually building these companies. So first and foremost, that's what's so exciting about, I think, the venture industry. But second, if you actually look at the way in which technology is evolving, and we focus mostly on financial services, as you know, but also really just foundational industries broadly. So we also focus on the future of energy, the future of industrials and manufacturing. Technology is transforming the global economy at, frankly, an accelerating pace. And it's transforming our daily lives in many ways at an accelerating pace. And being at the vanguard of that and seeing what that impact can look like is super fun. And now that venture capital has kind of emerged as this pretty big asset class at this point relative to what it was for most of its existence, which was kind of a cottage industry, you have a very long history at this point of innovation really driving change in just the basic sort of day-to-day welfare of society. And that's incredibly cool too. So you get to balance kind of this very personal, almost micro way of working where you're kind of in an intense collaboration with just another person or group of people with this very big picture, almost macro way of viewing venture capital from the top down that I think is really satisfying. And so I think that's kind of what gets us excited at Clocktower every day to come in and kind of keep plugging away, trying to find the next great iconic company to work with.
Now, Ben, you've had such an interesting career because you've really spanned almost all the roles of venture: an analyst, a director, a VP, a partner. You've really had the opportunity to grow through and see how others do it. And I'm curious, what do you feel that you notice in the world of venture or the industry that you're in that maybe others don't? What do you feel is your superpower that you've developed?
My superpower?
Your superpower.
With Clocktower, what I'm proud of that we've been able to do is, I think, build a great team at Clocktower. And so I don't know if it's a superpower of mine necessarily, but I think if part of being a venture capitalist is ultimately backing founders who are exceptional human beings in their own way, I think we've also done a pretty good job at Clocktower of bringing into our community and building a team inside Clocktower of exceptional people who are not necessarily the same sort of type as founders, right? I often say to people when they ask for kind of career advice, like very few people are really both an operator and an investor. I actually think there's like a dichotomy there. And most people are sort of better off suited to be an investor in venture or an operator. And especially with younger venture professionals, maybe they're not sure.
I was gonna ask, like, so within that regard, for some of the venture capitalists or investors that have been in the game now for 5, 10, 20 years, they've started to harden in sort of how they think about or how they navigate. But for newer VCs or for newer investors that are just starting their run, how should they think about, am I an operator? Am I an investor? Do you have any advice for how to help people kind of guide them so they don't become this good at everything but not great at anything?
I think the short answer to the question is that you really have to figure out where you have a spike. And there's something a little bit different about you, differential advantage relative to sort of the average person. And, as an investor, you have to accept that you're not the one, like I sometimes use this phrase, making the donuts. Right. And I had to stop using this phrase in my office because I realized that it just dated me too much. But they used to run these Dunkin' Donuts commercials, which, like, if you're old enough, you'll remember the Dunkin' Donuts commercials. And there's the donut maker who has to get up in the morning and go, it's time to make the donuts. And he's like rolling out of bed and he goes and makes the donuts. And investors aren't like making the donuts. You're not in the kitchen sitting there like kneading the dough and like making something. You're kind of standing on the sidelines, like maybe coaching, maybe lobbing in some instructions. Maybe you like borrowed some sugar from another person that or you introduced another cook to the kitchen, but you're not actually like doing it as an investor. You're not really building it. Whereas if you're an operator, you're like in the fight, you're building it. And, I had a professor in business school who had built an iconic tech company. And he was like, the great thing about business is that it's a battle. It's a competition every day. You're in this fight competing. And he loved that. And I think an operator, you really are doing it, competing, building. An investor, yes, to some extent, but it's much more of a coaching, enabling, facilitating, supporting kind of function. And I think many people sort of think, oh, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to run my own business. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But that's a different thing yet again. Like, because you can be an entrepreneur in lots of different capacities. That typically is more of an operator. But being a great venture investor, while it has aspects of entrepreneurship to it, it's quite different from actually like being kind of in the arena in the way that operators are. And I think that distinction is more meaningful than a lot of people appreciate.
Now, I asked you this on the last conversation because you've been a CEO. I said, like, isn't it hard not to just jump in and be like, you're doing it wrong? And you said to me, like, no, it's not hard. And I'm curious, like, how have you evolved to continue to become a better and better coach? What are the things that you've tried to improve over these last 10 years that you now look back on and say, wow, these are like steps that I've made to become a better investor?
That's a great question. I don't know if there's anything that I can point to that's a specific step. Some of it is simply just getting older. You get more perspective. But I think the biggest thing is whatever you think is going on in somebody else's mind, you really don't know, right? Like, and you have to have a lot of humility about that. And that when you approach a problem and we have a conversation about something that's challenging for you, you're doing the best you can to elevate for me the most important parts of that issue. And I'm doing the best I can to respond back to you with what I think about it. But I still am never going to know the fulsomeness of that issue. I'm not going to be able to cut through the totality of it because we don't have enough time. I'm not walking in your shoes. I'm not living that experience for you. And so if you don't really know everything that's going on, and how could you? You can't. You're just an investor. You're not like making the donuts every day. you have to have a tremendous amount of humility when you're offering suggestions. And I think the more you can embrace that, and the more you can embrace that, look, you're the one making the decision. You have to live with it. I'm sure there's a million things that I don't understand about this circumstance. But based on what I'm seeing, based on what you've told me, from the information I have, here's what seems like might be going on. I think the more you can lean both out from conviction, but also in toward, like, I'm here to support you with like this kind of
I'm sitting in the foxhole with you, right?
Yeah, like it helps because there's so much, especially the really challenging problems, right? Like on simple stuff, who cares? Like where VCs can add value is when there's a moment that matters. You want to be there for founder in the moment that matters. And in that moment that matters, you know what? It's complicated. Like, you know, it's going to be complicated or it wouldn't matter. And it's probably going to have high stakes. And it's probably going to have emotions entangled with it in that decision. And you, I think, to be a great coach or to be even a good coach, who knows if you're a good coach. And it's not even coach. Coach is, I think, often the wrong word. I think really what it is a partner. Because a coach is sort of like there's a teaching.
Yeah, right.
And there's like we're used to thinking of coaches as like, well, who works for who? Like, I don't even really like the word coach with respect to this. I think it's, can you be a good partner? And it doesn't even have to be that you're an equal partner, because you're clearly not. You're not making the donuts every day. There's a founder who's sitting there really building this business. But to be a partner means giving of yourself, right? And so you have to be willing to give, but you have to give in a way that it can actually be received. And that means trying to recognize that you're never going to know the fulsomeness of what's going on the other side of the table. And that's very humbling, actually. The second you realize that, you're like, oh yeah, I don't really know. But it actually makes it, I think, easier to sit there and go, based on what I do know, here's what I think. But it also leaves you open to changing your mind as you learn more information.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we see a lot with VCs, is that you kind of form a view, because in some sense you're paid to form a view about a business, about a founder, about something that's going on. But that view is necessarily always incomplete. Always incomplete. And so how do you leave yourself open as an investor to marginal information that can change that view? And it's kind of the same principle as a partner to an operator, which is that as you get marginal information from just talking and from learning and from observing, are you able to change your view? That's going to make you a better partner.
Now, when it comes to branding, I personally, and I'm sure others have different opinions, but I feel like Clocktower has done such a great job of branding and positioning yourselves as like, oh, if you're in finance, if you're a startup that's a FinTech company, who's the best VC fund? Like, Clocktower is one of the first that comes to mind.
Very kind of you.
Because, you know, it just feels like you guys have really, grown in this pocket. And I'm curious, like, if you could help people listening understand, like, who's the perfect fit for a Clocktower? Like, this might be someone's first time listening and they're just hearing about it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the types of companies and the sizes or the check size, just like a general, so people know a little bit more about the inner workings.
So we've evolved at this point to essentially be investors in what we call foundational economy industries, which include financial services, but also energy and industrials. And we do this pre-seed through growth rounds across different pockets of capital. So really, if you are an operator and a builder in those domains, we want to get to know you. As you mentioned, in financial services, that's really been our history and where we've sort of stayed focused. And the way we've tended to work is that we think there's value in depth of experience and depth of expertise in individual sectors. As a smaller fund in particular, we're not, one of these larger VC platforms. We think specialization is an advantage because it allows you to really understand the challenges inherent in certain business models in certain industries. And so what we like to be able to do is to meet founders who maybe are doing something a little bit funky, it's a little bit complicated, it's a little bit obscure in something like financial services, where you really have to understand the industry to understand why there's an opportunity there. And those are some of the most exciting stories that we can find.
When you look back, do you see that as an advantage that you've taken? Because I would imagine that, for every 10 amazing FinTech deals that come across your desk, there's one or two that are kind of outside of your purview.
Sure.
You're like, man, like that's a
Sure.
great idea. That's the right people. So, for someone like myself, I'm like, ooh, the shiny, let's go to where it's going. Have you had to calm yourself down or had to kind of, talk yourself through? Because I would imagine at some parts you want to try new things, but you also have this kind of like, this is what we do.
Absolutely. 100%. And part of that challenge is, if you run the anti-portfolio of that, maybe you miss some unbelievable opportunities because you said that's not what I do. So you can't be totally dogmatic about your rules, but you want to have some set of rules also to help you keep focused and remain true to it. I think a lot of this for us is just as investors, you have to underwrite any given opportunity with like, what do you know or think you know anyway? And then what do you really not know or think you don't know? And often when we look at businesses that fall outside of these kind of domains of competency for us, you get into a category, you get into lots of questions, categories of questions where you're not even sure what, like if you're asking the right question, you're not even sure if you have a sense of what the possibility space could even look like. And sometimes that just doesn't matter because, hey, that's such an incredible group of people. That's such an incredible idea. It created something new from whole cloth. Nobody knew anything about it. You couldn't have foreseen the future. But often in something like financials, for instance, like this industry has been around a very, very long time. And there's value in that background understanding of things. And every time you're tempted to stretch, it's really easy to sort of go, well, what do I not know? Right. And if you start asking that, very quickly you realize, man, you really don't know a lot. And I think that's helped us sort of stay in our lane, even when, financial services and FinTech have fallen pretty out of favor. Like 2 years ago, the conversation was FinTech is dead. Is it ever going to come back?
Yeah.
And we said it is, and here's why. And you stick to that knitting. And that, I think that discipline is helpful in the long run.
I think it's really interesting, and it's not often spoken about here on the podcast because, you could kind of like put enough evidence in front of you to be like, this is why we should do it. And you can kind of paint yourself in that picture and go down that, okay, if this happens, but you could also do the opposite, which is like, what are all the ways this maybe doesn't happen or that I don't understand it? And now all of a sudden you're giving yourself like the opportunity, for more like a fair decision in that way. Now, you've had the chance to back so many early stage companies. What's the most underrated quality that you see in successful founders? What makes you lean in and say like, yeah, this person has it?
I don't know if this is underrated or not, but I would say one of the things that it's actually tricky to get a read on when you meet founders, but something that does seem to correlate in our experience with outcomes is basically hard work. Like founding companies is a lonely journey. It's an exhausting journey. It's really a 24/7 journey. But there are certain people who, as you get to know them, and it's rare that you could meet somebody in a couple meetings and figure this out, but sometimes you can get little indicators that they are going to persevere. They are going to work incredibly hard. They're going to make it their mission to be successful. And by the way, this doesn't guarantee success, of course. This by itself is certainly not enough. But I do think what we found is that operators that are willing to just keep going and keep pushing find a way. Now, you can't just work harder. You have to work smart too. And there's a bunch of other things that have to indicate for success. But every now and then, as we're going through these processes, we meet somebody and you just go, wow, that's not somebody I want to compete with, right? It's almost like a question if you ask yourself, do I want to compete with that person? If you don't want to compete with somebody because like they would outcompete you, you know what, they're going to be pretty good. You might want to work with them. You want to be on the same team for sure. But you can almost imagine half the time, like if you were in an organization and like there's someone else who's like working harder than you, competing harder than you, winning in a way that even if you're great, maybe you just can't do it. That's a powerful indicator. It's rare. We typically don't find that kind of thing just because you don't get that signal that often. It's not that you have a view on it one way or another, But every now and then we'll come up with that view during a diligence process as we get to know founders. And when that happens, it's special.
Yeah, Minnie Ingersoll talked about something along the lines of like distance traveled, you know, not literally physically distance traveled, but like you're saying, you know, in the story of their life, you know, what was the travel like for them in the journey? Now,
some people just win, right? And like,
yeah,
you know, the question is like, why? And some people are lucky, some people are hardworking, some people have more sophistication, more resources, there's lots of reasons. But I think one of the things that seems to be the case with most people who are winners, especially repeat winners, is that they just keep working.
they don't give up.
Like,
Yeah.
they don't give up, but they're biased to action. They're hardworking. They're persistent, and it's constant, right? They're not people who are like, they're energized all the time.
Now, when most of the criteria is met to move forward on an investment, like they've got a promising team or their product looks great, but there's something in your gut that is telling you, I don't want to make the move on this. What are some of the usual red flags that come up in those situations where you're really struggling to decide one way or the other, and there's just something in your gut that's telling you, I'm going to pass on this one? Is there anything that tends to kind of be a pattern that you see in those sort of decisions?
I guess like I'm not sure that happens, right? Like, I don't know that we really get to a point where like there is maybe the separation that I would say is it's not like we have like an on paper checklist where things look good, but then there's some gut feeling that something is wrong, right? If that were to happen, I would say like, let's just go back to the beginning. Like, what are we actually trying to isolate? Like, because it should actually be the other way, that your sort of rational brain and your emotional brain and your emotions are aligned. If you're finding a sort of like a separation between those two things, you ought to be able to tease out what that is.
In our last conversation, you had referenced one of the red flags for you as being like they speak in the personal. An I statement versus a we statement. And so,
Sure.
you know, I know that was something you had mentioned where you're like watching, you're listening, you know, oh, this is interesting. I was curious if there's been other things over time that kind of like, and I think this is more from the perspective of sometimes founders get into investor meetings and they're so amped up and they're scared and they're nervous and they don't even realize that they're making these sorts of, mistakes. And so is there anything other than the I or we statements that for you signifies something that's like, I'm going to be aware of this?
Well, so like that I we thing is an example of just an indicator that could or could not be real of something that actually does matter, which is what is the underlying sort of orientation of that founder, that founding team, with respect to managing people, right? And building a culture in their organization. We say it all the time. Companies are just people. This is like bedrock for us. And you can't win if you don't get people aligned. And so the reason that I sometimes will click into, wait, there's a founder who talks about I, or it's my business, or I want to do it this way. Maybe to your point, it's just a pattern of speech and it's meaningless. But maybe it's indicative that when they really think about a culture and an organization, they see themselves.
The words that come out.
As right. The words are actually reflective of a view, and not just a pattern of speech. And if you push on that a little bit and you're like, okay, well, let's talk about like a question that we'll often ask is like, hey, if we were to grab, a couple employees at your company in 6 years and ask them to describe the culture of the company, what do you hope they'd say? Right. And what I like about a question like that is, first of all, some people just haven't even thought about it, and that's fine, but not as good as somebody who's thought hard about it. And somebody who's thought hard about it, you can sort of hear like in the way they'll answer that question. Because you think about what I'm asking you to do. It's not what I'm asking you to tell me. It's what
they will say
about a culture that's now 5 or 6 years forward and evolved, right? Can you really empathize with that? Can you kind of visualize this scenario and then hear how you want the culture of the company that you're starting today, which doesn't have that many people, What's your vision of what that might look like, and how do employees feel about that? And again, sometimes, not always, there might be some indicators in the vocabulary that someone will use even before I ask that.
Or the why
that
behind
question.
why they do something the certain way. It's like, oh, they've thought about it in a way
Yeah.
that helps me see their views on the world.
That's right. That's right. Because you can't, when you're ultimately what we're doing when we're backing founders is, yes, these are exceptional people, and their unique individual impact is hopefully enormous on the value that's going to be created over time. But at the end of the day, like, you can't take public for billions of dollars like a 3-person company, right? You have to build teams. And so you're backing talent that can build teams ultimately. That's critical.
I want to talk to you in a little about the 3-person company concept, because it's something I've been thinking of. I want to get your philosophy. But before I do, when founders receive a no from VCs, and I've heard from hundreds of VCs, it's one of the toughest parts of the job is just constantly saying no, no, no. I would imagine there tends to be like almost a binary, like people that do it the right way after people that do it the wrong way, meaning that you've said, hey, this is not a good fit for us right now, or, we're not ready, or we don't want to invest, or whatever that might be. When a founder receives a no from a VC, what should their immediate next step be? And how should founders act when they don't receive an investment? Like, what are the ones or the ways in which they act where later down the road it ends up coming back in a positive way?
I mean, I guess the word should is a tough word, right? Like, we very rarely want to tell founders you should do anything, right? I think what I would say is, as a VC, I think every VC's got stories where, like, you pass, you think you're trying to be open and transparent and honest, and you try to give reasons, and it's just not received very well. And like, that's unfortunate because that's not anybody's intention. Like, I would love to be able to say no to somebody in a way that they feel okay about that experience, all the time. Doesn't always work that way. We try really hard to say we are going to do, anytime we're passing, we're going to do our best to give a real pass, like with real reasons, not bullshit, not just, hey, it's not a fit right now, but we'd love to be helpful and stay in touch, and like actually lean into being honest, which is very much what we think matters, because that's what we think we would want if we were on the other side of that table. And it's also just our sort of way of being in the world. Like, we want to be known for being transparent, direct, no bullshit with people. I think, I often say, like, life is long. You're going to get to know people over a long period of time. And the more data points you get of interactions with folks, the better you can get a sense of, like, how's it going to go?
Yeah.
Because these journeys often have bumpy spots, and, you want it to feel as great as it possibly can when the going is good in the relationship between a founder and investor, because that's a big well of goodwill to draw on when the going is bad, right? If it doesn't feel great when the going is good, what do you think it's going to be like when it's tough, right? It's not likely going to get better. And it's not always easy in these things. So I think a lot of it is, we certainly don't use, I think there are VCs that might use how do people react to passes as like a data point. We don't put that much into it. I think the main thing that we just try to do is what we can control is, do we actually send pass notes? Like, do we actually follow through? Do we do what we say we're going to do? Do we do it with integrity, with honesty, with directness, with some compassion in it too, right? Like, it's hard to sit on the other side of the table and hear no's from VCs. And then the biggest thing we try to do in that experience is, like, we try not to basically burn time cycles of people. And so we'll actually often just say up front, hey, like, we don't think we're going to get there. We don't want to burn time on this. Sometimes we'll even calibrate for founders before we get into a process. Be like, look, this seems like a very long putt for us. And given everything we know, we're unlikely to get to yes. If you're interested in spending time with us, like, knowing that up front, we're interested in spending time with you for various reasons. But, like, we want to calibrate as much as we can. And I think we try to be as transparent as possible about it. And then, hopefully you kind of get back the same kind of goodwill that you put out into these
Yeah,
processes.
I mean, I would imagine that, cutting the time down to no is probably one of the things that you're able to do on your end, because if you're a founder waiting and waiting and waiting for it to, it's like the time in between is really what causes a lot of that pressure and stress. You guys have had now years to refine your process. I'm just curious, like, do you have a specific evaluation framework, or is there a way that the team kind of processes deals? And maybe you could just talk a little bit about like what your strategy is in that.
Sure. So we have a lot of frameworks we use. We're very framework oriented in how our investment process works, how we think just in general. Maybe the most sort of simple one that we would have is any investment that we look at, basically we think about 4 core dimensions: founder quality, narrative quality, fit, and value are sort of the 4 things that define our framework. And some of them are self-explanatory, some of them are not. Founder quality is usually pretty self-explanatory, but again, companies are just people. This is a business about who are we partnering with? Who are we giving resources to? What are the decisions they're going to make with those resources? Are they going to be able to attract other great people to their team to go build something? That's always the North Star for us. So that really is the first. Ordinally, it's the most important. The second idea, narrative quality, is a little more subtle. This is basically how good of a story is this business, is this company? And some of this is like as simple as we write relatively small checks. Most of the companies we're investing in lose money. They're going to need more money. Is it a story that's going to attract incremental capital to keep the business going, to get it where it needs to get? But it's also, is it a story that's going to make sense to acquirers, to ultimate terminal holders of risk in public markets, if that's the exit, to talent that's going to want to join it, to customers? Can they understand the story of this business and of this product, get excited about it, want to join it? Anyone that is a potential stakeholder around this endeavor, is this a story that's going to resonate with them? That's what we mean by narrative quality. And there's a lot of subtlety throughout that thing. Fit is mostly about, is it a fit for our portfolio? Is it a fit with the themes and ideas that we think are interesting in the world at any given time on a sort of 10-year time scale, which is what we're ultimately investing in? It's also, is it a fit with our values? In financial services in particular, there's a lot of ways in which you can build successful businesses, successful products that like are maybe, for lack of a better word, I'll say exploitative. And like, we don't want to do those things. So how do we make sure we're not doing those things? And also back to this idea that companies are just people, we really, again, back this idea of you're in a long journey with someone. You want to try to make sure that you see the world from a values and ethics standpoint roughly in the same way. And occasionally you run into folks where it feels like, wow, we have some different views about how this should work. And we want to avoid those kinds of partnerships because they're much more challenging partnerships to do. So that's fit. And then value is really, it's not last because it's the least important. But this is also generally somewhat straightforward. We think a lot about valuation and about what are the expected returns? How do we really underwrite this investment? In financial services in particular, I often say one of the nice things about investing in this category is that public markets have been telling you for 50 years how to value these firms. Like, what a bank, an insurance company, an asset manager, a payments business are going to be worth. What that will look like in public markets because we have a very long history of these businesses trading. And so we work backwards to think about valuation, and that really informs our decision making.
Now, what do you believe is the job of a CEO?
There's sort of like the job of a CEO, and then there's like what are the goals that a CEO has to navigate at any point in time. And so the goals that a CEO has to navigate, like what matters most for that company, which is really what in some sense the CEO is responsible for, is like overall oversight of a company. At different points in time, at different evolution of companies, you have different responsibilities. But ultimately, I think the job of a CEO is a people job. It is HR, right? Like, you have to get the people right across your organization. And if you do that as a leader, then all of the things that you then have to do, like making big, important decisions, it gets easier, and it's going to have a better set of outcomes if you have the right people to help support that decision-making process. Whatever underlying goal it is, selling product, developing product, like managing investors and stakeholders, all those things, you have to have the right people around you and then down through the organization. So in some sense, I actually really do believe that the best CEOs know how to set a tone, set a culture, design an organization that allows the best people to fit that organization, where there's a coherence, a congruence between the design of the organization, the design of the culture, and the goals that the CEO needs to hit in that particular period of time for that company, for that business.
Now, sometimes when you're looking at like a pre-seed or a seed stage company where there might only be 2 founders or 5 people on the team, you're still in that really kind of like moldy part of the organization. What advice do you have for founders when building their early team? Or what is a blind spot that you believe many founders undervalue or just miss altogether in building an early team?
The first people that you bring into your organization, they become the foundations of that organization, right? And so at one level, oh yeah, if I hired somebody really early and they chose to build in a particular coding language, right? Now we're sort of stuck in that coding language. Or if I hired somebody early and they chose to design, the logo of the business, like, oh, then we're sort of stuck with it. And that becomes like part of the brand identity. But all these things are also true about an organization's culture. And that the way in which the early people you hire interact with each other, the way in which they interact with outside counterparties really matters. And you have to, I think, be intentional in the very beginning when you're hiring, because most people, when they hire, they sort of replicate themselves a little bit. And that's good. You want to do that in the beginning. But sometimes I'll frame it for founders like, you have a culture. It doesn't matter if it's just 2 people, you have a culture. If you have 10 people, it's a culture. And you want to hire people that are like adjacent to that culture. You don't want, like, if this is your culture, you don't want to hire somebody that's over here, right? Because that sort of pops the bubble. But you want to hire somebody that's like right here. You want to stretch it just a little bit. Sometimes you're going to hire people right in the center. That's good too. Like, you're going to need to hire people that are just easy. They're right in the middle of the culture that you've designed. But you also have to be able to grow and evolve. Otherwise you become too narrow over time. But you also have to be careful not to go too far, because then you're breaking something that's nascent and early in developing. And this flows, I think, more than folks sometimes realize in the very early stages across everything you do.
Now that you've had, over a decade plus of experience as being an investor, if you were to give yourself a piece of advice, you're starting on day one again, you're talking to the younger version of Ben, what's one thing you would say, hey, if you want to be successful in this business now, these are the things that I think you should do?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. I think don't overcomplicate it. Like a lot of I think being a good investor is actually simplifying away complexity and cutting to the heart of the narrative, right? So we set our framework: founder quality, narrative quality, fit value. Narrative quality turns out to be really powerful.
Explain that.
Like, sometimes we'll talk about a business, and financial services lends itself to complicated businesses. And there's a lot of questions you might have to unpack about a business. But sometimes it's as simple as saying, what does this company do and how does it make money? And you just focus on that. And if you sort of go, does that sound like something good? Is there something intuitively, like you just hear that and you're like, oh, that seems like that should work. That's actually often like really the thread you should pull on. And then you can ask why. Why does that feel like something that's
because once you have the flow, you can start to crank on certain levers of it.
Because the simple answer, the simplistic way of thinking about a business, the dumb way of thinking about a business is often actually the best.
Yeah.
Because all the nuance, all the complexity, rarely in those sometimes, but rarely in those nuances and all that complexity is the one fact that's going to matter, right? Sometimes it's there, but usually those are all things where it's like, well, it's 10% of this or it's 10% of that. But getting the 80% thing right, that's often what matters most. Like we have a business in our portfolio now that is a very complicated business. It's a global business. It involves physical assets. There's a financial component to it. And we spend an unbelievable amount of time digging through every aspect of it. And in this particular case, we absolutely love this business, but it's a really complex story. And when we try to talk to other people about it, it's hard because you can get lost in the complexity of it. But there is a way of simplifying the story down that just says, look, they are a partner to a business that's worth $200 billion. They're a franchise partner to that company. And if you just step back and you go, what is that worth, right? And what happens to that industry and to their partner? And they're just really early in being sort of the other side of this very successful company that everyone in the world knows and understands really well. Then you can cut through all the complexity and go, right, that's going to be worth a lot. And sometimes that's actually, it sounds crazy, but that's actually the best way to go about it.
Yeah. And I'm curious, like, do you feel in looking and seeing more junior just out of their MBA program, is there a feeling like if it's not complex, then it's not a good investment? Or like, is that what you're, the tangential side of the simplicity is that sometimes you early on overcomplicate the models or trying to overemphasize all the pieces and you're saying, keep it simple. You know, is that the message?
Well, I think you have to be careful because you can't keep it too simple, right? Because then you're just sort of like naively following momentum or something like that. And so I think the real answer is, because you sort of framed it as what's the advice you'd give yourself, and some of this is Ben specific, is like you want to start simple, then go through all the complexity, and then figure out that you can cut it all away. But you can't ignore it, right? You have to work through it, but then make sure you're cutting it all away and not making what in hindsight looks like a what the heck did we do, because you overcorked it one way or another. Either you overcorked it to a yes or you overcorked it to a no, by virtue of all the complexity, when really you should have just looked at it and said, isn't it obvious that we should do this for these reasons? And sometimes remembering that actually will both get you into something that ends up being a huge win, but also prevent you from making a mistake.
Now, when you and I spoke last time in 2022, there was an air of uncertainty.
Sure.
We didn't really, it was August of 22. It's like, what's going to happen in Q4? What's going to happen like in 2013, in 2023? How would you describe the current state of the funding ecosystem? Can you talk about, what you're seeing in the grander, industry of venture right now?
Sure. I mean, there's a million things going on in the venture world right now that are fascinating. I think the short and sweet version is there's a tremendous amount of capital available in the venture capital industry today, more than there's literally ever been. At the same time, that capital is concentrating more than ever before in both some very large businesses that are really not
like OpenAI or like that sort
like
of
growth stage sorts of things. But also it's just thematically very concentrated around AI centric stories. And I think when we talk to our peers, almost every VC has stories of, wow, I've got this great little business, sometimes not so little, that's doing really well. It's compounding really nicely, and I can't get anybody to care. It's hard to raise capital for this story right now because it just happens to not be the AI version of the thing. And our view is it's likely that there's a lot of great investment opportunities in those stories and in those companies. But I also have a friend who recently sold his business and he had pivoted and built an AI thing. He said to me the other day, he said, I think this is the greatest time in the history of Silicon Valley to sell your company. But it's also a necessary time to sell your company, because I think if you're a founder today, you have to look at what you're doing and ask a really hard question, which is you're either going to be the winner in your space in an AI-centric world, or you're going to lose. And if you're not sitting there saying, I have a way to use AI to be the winner, I believe there's something about what we've done, then you're sort of at risk of being disrupted at a much faster pace than we ever would have thought possible by an AI-centered version of whatever it is you're doing. And if that's the case, you should my friend was basically saying, you should sell this thing. And I think VCs have actually like very much internalized this, that it's more compelling to just fund the disruption of like the earlier stage thing, but that's AI-centric around it. And so this creates a really complicated environment for founders at anything other than the seed stage or the very late stage, right? Where you're so early that you're going to be building around AI if you're at the seed stage. And if you're very late, you've already got sort of a bigger business. It's a different problem. Everything in the middle, the market has changed in a hurry on those founders. And I don't know how that's going to play out.
I wanted to ask a follow-up with that around, you've been talking, one of your core, reflections here on the podcast in both today's episode and the first one we did is companies are just people. And I'm curious if you have a philosophy around, when you close your eyes and you look 3 years or 5 years out, kind of seeing where things are going with, you could do so much with AI. Do you envision that, companies will continue to be just people? Do you see it as much smaller teams of 2 to 3 people, but hundreds or thousands of agents working for them? And I'm just curious, when you kind of, think about the future, how do you see that transition or lack thereof of companies are just people?
Yeah. So it's kind of a deep topic because you get into the nature of like, what's going to happen to the economy? How is labor going to be adjusted as a function of AI in the long run? I would say, without going through all the reasoning of it, yes, companies are still going to be people. They're going to be people that have enormous numbers of agents working for them. They're going to be people whose productivity gains are extraordinary relative to what we can accomplish today. But I believe firmly that the bedrock of humans organizing into hierarchical for-profit like constructions is not going to change in any profound way. But that, for sure, there will be startups that achieve unbelievable things on much smaller numbers of people than they have before. And there are real consequences from the advent of AI to organizational design models that we are just seeing the beginnings of.
You may have no I feel as a founder, I'm so heads down in our business, trying to grow and stay alive and all of these things. It's very passive when you're talking to your friends and you're like, well, what's going to happen if all the Uber drivers are self-driving cars? And what's going to happen if, do you have a perspective on the middle? Like what happens, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, so many of these, DoorDash and Uber and all of these, do you have a perspective for someone that knows nothing about the economy and how that could impact or, I know we're just making predictions here, but what happens to people if there are no jobs?
So I think there will always be jobs.
Okay.
I think the question is, what are those jobs, right? And, if you look at technological cycles over long periods of time, there have been big waves of innovation that led to real disruption in the workforce. That disruption has real challenges for us as a community, as a civilization, as a society. They're often political challenges. They're hard to navigate, right? It also matters a lot how fast those disruptions happen and how quickly some of these things occur.
Is that the most surprising part for you under the, there is the printing press, but then it takes time to the district, like it feels like every month or every week it's moving so quickly. Is it surprising you how quickly from a year ago to where we are now, or not surprising at all?
So I think the economic disruption from AI, I don't know that anyone has a handle on just how fast that's really happening. You mentioned like drivers, Uber drivers, DoorDash drivers, things like that. We actually happen to know a fair bit about the velocity of robo-taxis and things like that. That will not, I believe, happen to like dislocate people from an employment standpoint, maybe all that fast, partially because it's still pretty hard to actually just like get a robo-taxi on the road. Like there's not that many of them. The OEMs aren't making them all that fast. It's like sort of difficult. It's accelerating. So that particular transition, I think, will take a few years. But there will be dislocation in logistics, right? The question is, can we, as a society, do things to help reskill, retrain those people? What are the jobs that are going to emerge that become sources of value?
Yeah.
around that, and can we sort of shape the economy to prepare for that? I actually think this is a really important political question, and I think it will be something that actually starts to really dominate a lot of the dialogue in Washington over the next several years. We just haven't seen it happen yet because it's very hard to pinpoint like where is this stuff really manifesting. But ultimately, I'm incredibly optimistic, I think, about what all this new technology is capable of doing. And through all of our history, when we've had these waves of technological disruption that dislocates people out of jobs, it ends up working out to be better in the long run for the economy. And that's because productivity is actually really like one of the core sources of wealth creation for our civilization, for humans. We have to be careful to make sure that those productivity gains are widely distributed rather than concentrated. But I think it will end up being really, really wonderful for us.
Ben, can you share a piece of advice or wisdom that you wish you had known earlier in your career? I think you've already kind of highlighted that in the simplicity of, kind of how you try to approach deals. So maybe I'll kind of pivot to when you think about the early days of Clocktower Ventures, what is the change that you see in yourself as an investor today?
I think the best advice I can give people, and again, maybe some of this just comes from being older, is like, just be vulnerable. The more vulnerable I think you can be as a human being, whether it's in your personal life or in your professional life, and just be open with other people about what you're afraid of, what you see as a risk, what you're uncertain of. I think it makes it that much easier for other people to want to be your partner and to want to support you. And, I think that's very hard for a lot of people to really be vulnerable. But I have learned over time, the more that you can lean into that, it has very surprising, powerful consequences, I think.
Ben, we always finalize our podcast by asking if you could give a special shout out to anyone in the world that's made a monumental impact on your life. Last episode, you gave big shout out to Mom. Who gets the honor today as someone that deserves a thank you and I love you, or a you meant a lot to me?
Sure. If it was my mom on the first, it's got to be my wife on this one. Shout out for basically putting up with me all the time. I think I'm incredibly fortunate to have someone that in my wife Laura, who is just so supportive and so warm and caring. And somebody who everyone who gets to know the two of us just likes more than they like me, which is maybe a low bar, but nevertheless, fantastic. And so be my wife this
Amazing. Ben, we are so lucky to have you again. Episode 2 here. You made it back for a second at Demo Day. And for anyone that's at home listening, if they're building the future of FinTech or they want to learn more about Clocktower, what's the best way to get, in front of you, get in front of the company? And yeah, what do you, where can people find you guys?
Very easy. Go to our website, LinkedIn. There's lots of ways to get in touch with us.
Amazing. Ben, thank you again for coming. Everyone watching at home, I'm Sean Goldfaden from Coefficient Labs, and this is Demo Day. Peace, guys.